Real pleasure to be here. Nathan, thank you, and Amanda, thank you both very much for hosting me and Rob. We're thrilled to have a chance to share with you. This is basically the too long didn't read version of the book. So, by all means, get the book, but, if you don't have time, just hang in there, pay attention for 30 minutes or so, and you'll kind of get the gist of it as well. So the book and this talk start by describing the problem with scale. Now, I'm in a 200-person company. I can't begin to imagine what life is like if you work at Google and so forth. But even as scale increases with any group, you get a number of challenging dynamics. And one of them is something that from your direct experience. You may not have known the name of it, the Ringleman effect. So imagine you've got two teams playing tug of war, this pretty blatant clip art we've got here, stock image. The more people you have pulling on the rope, the less hard everybody pulls. Each individual on average pulls. Does that make sense? So if it's one person on both sides of the rope, they'll be pulling with all of their strength. You get 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 people on each side of the rope. The average amount of effort decreases fairly predictably, and there's actually a significant amount of research on that. One such piece of research done by a couple of companies you might have heard of showed that the average amount of normalized effort per individual decreases as you go from a group of like a single person initiative to a 32-person initiative. This is a scientific research paper that set things up to actually be able to demonstrate how much effort each individual was putting in. And you see a pretty dramatic fall off in the amount of effort that each individual puts in. But the magenta red line going up shows this is the net productivity of the group normalized by people. So that even though each individual is working less hard, there still is some net collaboration benefit that arises. And so we'd sum this up in the book by saying teamwork is best, but it's rarely our best work. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, but wanted to begin to get into some of that. Rob, do you want to summarize some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks. So a bit of research from PlanView, and I actually found this statistic pretty shocking. And it is, I don't know if you've seen it before, but engineers only spend about 8% of their time on activities that directly produce deliverable work. So my take on that is 92% of engineers' time is spent consumed with other things. Like those other things may be important, they may not be important, but emails, meetings, admin, waiting around, approvals, all of those sort of things. And if we think about that and the implications, if engineers are not spending most of their time on value creating activities, then that's actually directly impacting an organization's ability to innovate, deliver new products, and actually respond to user needs and demands. In the report there, one of the suggestions they have is to actually focus on streamlining workflow, continuous delivery, and looking at how to maximize the time engineers can spend on what they do best and actually what they want to do. And that is the creation and the building of things. That probably sounds familiar, maybe hint some of the DORA findings that we've seen over the previous years. But let's have a quick day in the life. Look, I pick up a new task, I want to go. I'm ready to do the coding. Oh, hang on, the requirements are a little bit ambiguous. Do you know what? Let's start coding anyway. We'll work it out. Oh, somebody's already pinging me. There's a bit of scope creep. It's now becoming a bit more complex. Fine, we're making progress, don't care. Oh, hang on a minute. I need to speak to this other team over there. I need to join a queue to get some stuff from that other team. Oh, there's a couple of bottlenecks. Oh, okay, dang, now I have this dependency I need to work on. I quickly need to rework something. I know I'm creating technical debt, but just I need to get this stuff done. And oh, now I'm getting pinged all the time about some escalations because I'm not going quick enough. And all I want to do is get this thing built, this feature out. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And these are fairly common, and actually these are very visible things that get in the way of that value creation or creating a thing. However, there's invisible things that get in the way. And these are part of human nature often, but one of the big ones is having different perspectives or different views. In larger organizations, sometimes this is just pure politics, but as humans, we have different perceptions or different perspectives are coming out when we're creating a thing. We also have conflicting goals, like as teams or as individuals. Like if, as a simple example, I personally might be incentivized to keep stability and consistency of the product. Whereas Andrew, he might actually be incentivized to release more often with more experimentation and just innovate. They can be conflicting, and they're often invisible things that get in the way. Or thirdly, just have different roles and scopes and responsibilities in what we're trying to achieve. And these are what we call the breaking my code, exactly. These are often the invisible things that we don't think about that much, actually. So we end up having this thing we're balancing the business desire to deliver new features, while also working on all those improvement activities that we know we need to do. They all make part of this big, large backlog, which is fine. But then we have technical debt to deal with and a whole load of fires and defects and problems and distractions. We don't have people saying, let's do more with less, let's go quicker, I need more features, just be quicker, better, faster, and also keep everybody happy. We now have a problem. This is a big challenge that I think we all face, or have all faced at some period in time. Like, how do we get around this? Help. Like, what do we do?
So I appreciate that when I'm presenting those slides, like the average normalized effort per person going down on bigger teams, and I'm not meaning to put that forward in a fatalistic way. And the reason that Rob went through these challenges is to point out that there are very specific things that cause interference, distraction, disengagement, and disorientation when teams work together at scale. And there's very specific things we can do to try to reduce all of that friction, the difference of perspectives and these kinds of things. And so that's the essence of the book Flow Engineering, is to talk about these 5 things, basically, that there are 5 fundamental things that if you can get these in place on a psychological level, they'll help tremendously the group to be more effective in their way they work together. The first is focusing on value, focusing on outcomes. And the second, when you're looking at process improvement, for example, moving from the way we, as DORA's slogan, getting better at getting better, right? If you're trying to get better at something, where are you starting from? Understand the current flow. Then identify the obstacles. What's impeding the current process? Defining opportunities. Where do you have the opportunity to improve this or that and so forth? And then planning the next steps. And so this is all about the primary focus is internal process improvement. When we're here talking about value streams, and obviously, DORA, the paper that we wrote together for DORA, the guide, is about value stream mapping. When we talk about value stream, you want to start by thinking about what is the customer value that you're going to be delivering. It might be an external customer, it might be an internal customer. You start with that customer value and then work backwards. And the value stream means the sequence of activities that are required to actually deliver that value, that customer satisfaction. So there might be an enablement step, and prior to that, there's a delivery step. Prior to that, there's a testing step in which they spend a lot of time breaking the developer's code. And the development is really where we think often a lot about the heart of the activity. It's a lot of the creative activity, but that's preceded by design and planning and so forth. Yeah, I think there's just a bit of a lag here. So together, this starts with the business hypothesis, and it creates a linear process. But as we know from the DevOps feedback loop, that this needs to be an adaptive loop. It needs to be a continual learning process. So this process of learning and adaptation is really the essence of the value stream. And anybody who's familiar with these 3 ways of DevOps: flow, feedback, and continuous learning, the value stream is a generalization of that. And so when we think about this, we're talking the first benefit, sorry, just playing with the slides here. The first benefit of this, of taking a value stream mapping approach, is to promote a systems thinking mindset. Now, in every organization that I've ever been in, there's the most well-maintained system diagram of the organization is the org chart. And an org chart is a system diagram. It's a simple hierarchical diagram, and it displays the power relationships, the power hierarchy in the organization. And that's really quite important because, you need to know who to request time off from, and, you need to know how with the chain of approval and so forth. But typically in any org chart, there's a very siloed visibility and siloed activity. There's a strong tendency to just focus on that segment of the org chart. And this is, this is very much in like primate psychology. We're always looking at who's in the center of the pack or the tribe. When we talk about value streams, though, we realize that to deliver customer value, often that process snakes its way through the enterprise. And so there's a business hypothesis somewhere else over in the enterprise, but it requires collaboration across all of these silos to actually get work done. And so the flow is another system diagram that's hidden inside the org chart. And you still can get a siloed visibility on that. You only know the part that's directly adjacent to your work and maybe a couple of coworkers left and right. But if you contrast these two views, they're both system diagrams, but they lead to very, very different ways of thinking. The org chart leads to thinking, okay, who's in power in the organization? How do I get approval and whatever else? But the value stream focuses on how do I get things done? And one very significant thing about the org chart is that the customer is not on the org chart. I've never seen an org chart where the customer was on it. The customer is typically somewhere else, right? And so the org chart itself, just as a mental model, tends to promote this very internal focus. And so if you begin to look at where are these value streams in the company, well, of course, there's product development, value stream, and there's managing service requests, help, support tickets and so forth. And then there's the onboarding process, and you begin to look more and more and more, and you begin to realize that the whole org is just full of all these value streams. And you realize that the reason we get paid to show up every day is because theoretically we're delivering value to somebody somewhere as part of some value stream. And in one day, depending on your role, you might participate in many of these, handling this request or that request and so forth. But we often don't have a very good map of what's going on. We don't actually have a visual picture of the whole process.
And so that's one of the big benefits. One of the second benefits we think is actually visualization, and humans, we thrive on it. We see this referenced in previous DORA, State of the DevOps reports, and what we try and do is make it easier to understand complex systems or things, help identify bottlenecks and track progress. And that visualization, actually as humans, we are very visual creatures. And that can range from early days cave paintings through to the most intricate data visualizations that we can see. And we always, as humans, seem to look for understanding of the world through imagery. And it's typically not just about aesthetics. It's really key, that visualization is key to unlocking our cognitive potential. And there's lots of evidence and lots of research into this space. And I could spend probably 2 hours going into all of this in its own right. So I'll try and do this pretty quickly. But what we see is the evidence is suggesting a number of things. One, the visualization can help enhance the understanding and memory. So visuals tap into a different cognitive process than if it was just text-based. And what that ends up doing is helping create different pathways for encoding and retrieval. And that act of drawing actually forces the brain to actively engage with information in a different way, which then in turn leads to a deeper processing and a better retention and understanding. And I think we're probably all used to, maybe not the visualization side of it, but maybe the verbalization of it, which is similar. So something I used to do in a previous life as a network engineer is whenever somebody came to me to ask for some help, I'd get them to sketch out the topology and explain what's going on. And 9 times out of 10, when they've done that, they actually work out the problem themselves and a solution for it. And turns out it's a form of rubber ducking before I even knew what rubber ducking was. But then also, if we look at the visualization, it helps improve problem solving and reasoning. And this is what the researchers are suggesting. It helps us organize information, identify relationships, and generate new ideas. And if we think about typical organizations, this can be really important because often we are siloed. Often we don't fully understand what each other is doing, the different teams. So helping visualize this can bring the connections together, and not only a shared understanding as a value stream, but actually help the brain unlock and process things in a different way. And then lastly, it actually helps increase creativity and innovation. And it allows for that free-flowing thinking, and often we'll have unexpected connections. And the really important thing for visualization for me is actually it helps with that shared understanding as well as a team. The third big benefit that we think from doing these sort of exercises of value stream mapping is continual learning and improvement. And we know from DORA, like many years of the DORA research around the benefits of continual learning, the importance of having a culture of continuous learning, and how critical it is at helping teams get better at doing what they're trying to achieve. And that can be through leveraging the structural equation models and having a representation of like this, and this are all connected. We also, my mind has just gone blank there. Yeah, so the structural equation models, but also we know the importance of, as a group, trying to improve and get better, as well as individuals trying to get better. One thing to note before I go on to the next slide, actually a big side benefit of doing these exercises is documentation. We know documentation is foundational. We know the DORA research highlights documentation as foundational. Doing a value stream mapping can actually be part of your documentation. It's really great for newcomers into the team. You can point them to the last value stream and say, this is what the end-to-end flow looks like for our value here, for our like product or service, whatever it may be. And we can also historically look back over time and see where we've improved, what improvements we've made. But if we look at the two aspects of improvement, really there's often the personal, individual improvement. How do I get better? How does Andrew get better? How does Nathan get better? Like, how do we get better just daily in what we do? And this often involves a deep focus. Increasingly, you start to hear the term flow, the psychological concept called flow, thrown around for this space. And that's really being in the zone, having a mental state where you are fully immersed, fully energized in solving and also enjoying solving that problem. It's often defined as the optimal experience. And actually, if I remember rightly, this statistic is the way you achieve that is finding the right balance between your skill set and the challenge. And that if you can stretch your skill set by about 4%, that's actually when scientists have started to find you start to get into that flow state. But without going into too much detail on that, really what it requires is a heads down execution. You just get down, focus on the problem. However, in organizations, we are typically not just the only person doing everything. There's actually a team involved. So we need to work well with others. And if we look at that collective flow and how we get better as a team, we need to understand how we work together and how to be the most efficient at working together. So minimizing those delays, removing friction, identifying common pain points that are impacting both the team and individuals. And what this requires is stepping back as a collective and looking at the bigger picture.
So Rob shared early on about these invisible challenges of differences of perspective and differences of values or goals, differences of scale, and so forth. And one of the main things that we brought out in the book are that there's a kind of psychological alignment across teams that you need if you want to maximize the individual flow, the individual performance, as well as the team flow. So if you want to enable flow, one of the precursors to that is to build clarity, to increase the clarity of your understanding, as with that network diagram example that Rob gave, right? So effectively, he was working with his colleague to help them increase their clarity. And as soon as they increased their clarity, the obstacle was apparent. But the precursor to building clarity is identifying the value. Like, what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish? And as it's almost seems trivially simple, but it's inevitable that different groups of people will have slightly different values. And often those values are the real underlying values are psychological values that typically around reputation and so forth. And it takes some significant work to really reorient your mind around delivering customer value, right? The ideal state of we're all working together as a team to deliver customer value, we shouldn't assume that that is necessarily already present in place. It's something that needs to be built by helping to build empathy for the customers and so forth. So these three, in the book, we talk about how these three make something of a cybernetic targeting loop, is the way we describe in the book, that the value is the target that you're pointing to, the understanding that you gain, the clarity, the understanding that you gain, and then the flow relates to the action. And that this kind of a targeting loop exists at an individual scale, at a team scale, at an organizational scale, that this is a somewhat scale-free pattern that was talked about from the early days of the cybernetic movement in the mid-20th century. And so what we're really encouraging is that this process of team visualization, this team mapping, that you're learning by doing. And I love the quote at the beginning of this, that whether you're listening or talking, you are an active participant in the conversation, because listening attentively is a powerful way to participate. But this shared whiteboarding, collaborative whiteboarding, I think is a missing superpower for organizations, because it gives another level of activity that helps to keep our minds engaged in this world of constant distractions and so forth, that there's all of these different benefits that arise by the team actually building these pictures together. Engagement, shared ownership, alignment, you can customize it. It's not just a template that you're borrowing from somebody else, and you can do it remotely, digitally. Okay. So on the topic of how do you actually do a value stream mapping exercise, in the book we talk about these 5 kinds of mapping, starting with outcome mapping. And the reason we start with outcome mapping rather than just diving right into value stream mapping is because often the teams, well, if you don't spend the time to figure out what are we actually trying to accomplish, then the value stream mapping may not deliver real valuable results. It may be that you end up optimizing a process that wasn't that important, and you can't really get buy-in for carrying out the plans you had. And so it's quite important to figure out what it is that you want to accomplish first with any value stream mapping exercise. And this is a collaborative mapping exercise. So imagining that you're looking at a value stream that involves a whole software development process, the people that you'd want involved, you want an executive sponsor or somebody with some relative degree of power in the organization to be involved, informed upfront, ideally a participant in the process, because what happens in the mapping activity is that there is a shared understanding that is built, right? So the mapping, we often say, is more important than the map. I'm certainly happy to share a link to the slides after this. It can be very helpful to have a skilled facilitator, depending, especially if it's a high stakes kind of process that you're doing. A skilled facilitator can be a neutral third party, help draw out any voices that are not being active in the conversation. But if you want to just get started yourself, practice on a relatively lower stakes thing to build up your facilitation skill, because it's a distinct skill. But you would then want to have some representative stakeholder of all of the other main areas of focus within the organization. And so the outcome mapping exercise is a brief preliminary activity that begins with just surveying the landscape, like what's on people's minds, what are the pains, what are the goals, what questions are arising, what ideas does anybody have, like what's top of mind related to, in the general area of the challenge. And this here, you're soliciting the ideas from the group. And you can categorize them, color code by pains and so forth, or do other methods to begin to group things together. And then there's various ways you can do it, but typically something will stand out from the group, like this releasing twice as often might be something that stands out. And you can have voting exercise, this called dot voting exercise. A lot of what digital whiteboarding platforms have ways of doing this. If you're doing paper, you can just make little notes on the post-it notes. But you vote for what is really the primary area of focus. And so then you take that primary area of focus, that outcome. You want to release more frequency. You want maybe a 2-week lead time. And then you enumerate the benefits, and you make this a collaborative activity. Like, what are the benefits? Because what this does, it forces people into a thinking process. Just by virtue of them being in the conversation, they have to think, okay, well, what are the benefits? Well, I can't think of any benefits. Well, that's something you want to know early on. Like, if they can't think of any benefits, that is going to have a definite impact on how the team approaches the work, right? So thinking about the benefits, thinking about what are the obstacles. You might have some people in the group who are just always saying, you know, a little pessimistic. You know, they're the testers, right? A little bit on the skeptical side as opposed to the optimistic side. You need those voices. You need those skeptical voices to be raised early so you can be explicit and conscious about what are the possible obstacles. And then very simply, you know, what are the next steps? You've got some action-oriented people in the group, you know, and one of the great next steps here is, of course, to do a value stream mapping exercise to begin to find the constraints. So one of the diagrams we put out in the paper is this, this way of relating a value stream diagram to the 4 keys in DORA. So the way we do this is understanding that there are actually 2 value streams. There's the happy path, when everything goes right, you build your software, you deliver it out to production. But then there's the incident recovery value stream, or the not so happy path. And so when we look at the DORA metrics align to these 2 value streams. So the lead time and deployment frequency are on the happy path, but the failure rate and recovery time are on this. It is a value stream, the incident recovery path. How quickly can you recover? The recovery time is just another kind of lead time on time to restore, time to recover.
And if we look at the flow in the context of DORA, looking at software delivery, the way of looking at this is, especially if the objective is the 2-week lead time. Let's say on the right-hand side, it's releasing our software to our customer every 2 weeks. On the other side, we're starting at the code commit. Now, one of the tricks, and I think I accidentally started doing this, but Andrew and Steve go into more detail in the book about starting from the right-hand side. So starting from the kind of the objective, the goal, and working backwards. Actually, I found it's really useful, and it alters the conversation a little bit. Like, usually people know the left-hand side really well, and they can start to build out. They know the right-hand side less, or in an exercise, you end up rushing that right-hand side. So it's good to start the other way and work backwards. Andrew does go into more detail in the book onto this, but first of all, kind of just map out simply with the blank canvas, map out the steps. You can use a whiteboard or the digital tool, whatever is applicable for you. In this case, we're just doing the happy path. I would strongly recommend doing the unhappy path, but just because of time today, the example is the happy path. The question that often comes up is, how much detail do you put in? Like, these flows could be extremely complex and take an entire room of a whiteboard, plus paper going out the door and all the way down the corridor. Equally, you could have it really simple of commit code, magically it ends up in the customer. The balance or the challenge is to get the right balance. So it's not overwhelming in detail, but equally it gives you enough information to see what potentially is holding you back, what potentially is a blocker, where the friction actually exists. And it can be that you start really simple, then you go for a second pass. And it could be actually there's a CI build in there, I think. And maybe you want to go into more detail around the CI build because actually there's a bit more of a challenge and you think that could be a potential issue. So maybe that one sticky of CI build, you break into unit tests, into integration tests, code analysis, whatever it may be. And you go to the right level of detail that's needed to inform you on what you're trying to achieve. Also capture some of the kind of the flows and the arrows and the point of direction, and also the interaction with teams. I found it useful previously to actually make a note of which team is involved in these things, especially in an organization that is extremely siloed. It's useful to know where those handoff points are and some notes sometimes. So now we have the rough flow captured. So if we zoom in, we can then start to look at two things. One is the time it takes for each step to happen, and also the delay between each step. So measure the time waiting between the steps. So we can, like, these are completely made up numbers. I don't even know if they make sense, but they're completely made up. But where we've got here is it takes, for example, 1 hour to do the pull request, then 3 weeks for a code review, then the build takes 1 hour, etc., etc. Then on the bottom time, how long it takes between those. What's the delay? What's the handoff delay? Often because there's a human involved. Like, a human isn't often stood waiting for you to finish your task to immediately jump on it. They have their own backlog. So what is that time frame? And then when you have that, you can start to see some hotspots. So as I said, completely made up. It turns out this completely made up one, code review is the problem. It's not unusual for customers to have code review as a blocker. But in this case, we can see 53% of our total time is hung on code review. That's probably a good place to start and actually have that meaningful discussion around, is this really a problem? Should we improve it? How could we improve it? What is a plan? And let's actually take action and make meaningful steps to change.
And Murali, you'd had a question before. Did you want to?
Yeah, Andrew, can you go back on the slides, on which slides you're talking about? I have small confusion on the value proposition you're talking about, native path, the previous slide of this. Yes, so the failure rate and the recovery time, right? I understand the happy path case, like you figuring out happy path. Like, I didn't understand exactly the failure rate mean here.
Okay.
And time to recovery.
So the failure rate from the DORA research, obviously, I'm don't need to tell you guys, but it's the percentage of deployments that lead to some failure, right? So don't go breaking my code. What percentage of those failures? And so as your deployment frequency increases, if you don't bring the failure rate down, you're going to have a lot of things entering that incident recovery queue. And so the reason to reduce the failure rate is to reduce the likelihood that something enters that incident recovery queue. But I'll look at the expert here if anybody wants to.
One of the things I'll add on, don't just focus on the happy path, but look at how do you deal with an incident when it happens, because it will happen. Yeah. So it's important to understand that flow for when things go wrong, because actually it's a very stressful situation. And we know as humans, when we're under pressure and stress, we aren't able to think as clearly. So understanding what happens and maybe preemptively putting things in place to make it easier when things go wrong and improve that flow is a good thing.
Yeah. This especially here, the struggle is how do you build a metrics and try to the developers, explain to the developers the time they're spending in this area is the time we can spend on the writing more tests is more valuable, right? It's so less.
I think this is a good segue into the pitfalls section, because one of the main pitfalls is because Kinar asked a very similar question. So Kinar said, how do we get detailed metrics on the developers? Do we just ask the developers? Because that's very, very subjective. One of the big pitfalls in my mind is thinking that you need very precise data to do this exercise. And so when Rob was showing that previous value stream map, and there was a 3-week waiting period on code review, right? And then there's a 1-day waiting period, for example, to begin the testing process, just as whatever it is. So whether it's 1 day or 0.736 days or 1.643 days, doesn't matter if you have a 3-week waiting period on the code review. And so typically there's a huge amount of variation in this process. And that's one thing that certainly for me as an engineer, I love precision. I want real precise numbers, and I could easily spend years just gathering all the data. But unfortunately, there's a huge amount of variation in this, and it's a very messy process. And so here we have to satisfy ourselves, or satisfice, if you like that term, satisfice with very approximate numbers. It's an order of magnitude. And that itself is a wise approach, because you're limiting the amount of time and energy you're putting into gathering data. You just need to gather enough data to sort of say roughly and in general. And one of the things that would, the value stream mapping exercise can be done in an hour or 2 hours. Or if you want to get really precise about it, you can spend weeks and weeks and weeks trying to gather, because the answer to everything, how long does this take? Well, the answer to everything is, it depends. And then there's too much variation to really get through the exercise. And so train yourself to be happy with a very coarse level of granularity, but do the exercise regularly. And as you do the exercise regularly, you can then start to get more precise data and then decide, you know, I think actually we really ought to instrument this step and figure out how long it really takes. And then there's tooling and so forth that you can use to begin to get deeper instrumentation on this. But that would be one pitfall. Rob, what pitfalls come to your mind?
Yeah, there's two big ones, and it's similar to where you were alluding actually going into. We always want all of the information. Sometimes trying to get too much information just holds us back. And when I'm working on, be it DORA specific workshops or something that involves VSM, the biggest pitfall I see generally is too much focus on getting the perfect map or the perfect metrics or the perfect everything and not taking action. Like, I'd rather have a partial view of the entire flow, but put something meaningful in place to try and improve. And that is, for me, the biggest gotcha. I can't count how many times an organization or a team we've gone through a VSM exercise and kind of partially agreed on what the actions are going to be, but then everybody goes and not looked at for another year, and then we start the conversation again. Agree as a team what you want to do, make it small enough that you can actually influence it, and go do it. Take the action. That is, for me, the biggest gotcha and pitfall.
Cool. We're close to the end of the slides. I think maybe we'll power forward here. There's another pitfall that was immortalized in this cartoon, and I felt like we were hitting the big time when we were getting publicly made fun of by Comic Agile. So the essence of the cartoon is, you know, don't just do superficial changes that make it look like you're improving flow, but look at the real issues that are underlying, right? How do you remove dependencies and so forth? Okay. Yeah, go for it.
I think the first one is have a read of the guide. Dora.dev/guides. It's in there. There was a link earlier. I think Steve and Nathan both put it in. Have a read of the guide. Let us know what you think. We think it's a good way of getting started in this with the lens of DORA or software delivery.
And then take a look at the book. You've now got the too long didn't read version of the book, but having the book around can help you to, you know, point to it and wave it around and introduce it to other people. And because this is very much a human activity, and Steve and I tried to go into as much depth as we could or as felt appropriate to you know, to explain some of the human dynamics going on beneath this. But it's a very, very brief and you know, concise and readable book, thanks to the editors who cut out so much stuff. So it's a book that's sized so you can actually get through it.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's only a handful of books I would recommend, and I have no commission for this, and it's not because Andrew's buying me a drink for saying it, but it's actually a good read. It's a good, useful book. I've learned quite a lot from reading, so strong recommendation. As Nathan at the very start said, we will do a lean coffee version of this where the discussion is the majority. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And I think the biggest takeaway that we think is go and integrate VSM into your workflow. Like, go do it now as a team. Pick something. We know the DORA research gives us that shared language of framework for improving software delivery. And VSM really offers that visual language that the whole team can understand. And we get a few long-term effects by actually going to do it. So that improves software delivery, enhanced operational efficiency, and increased transparency and accountability. Just go and start. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. In fact, it won't be perfect the first time you do it. Accept that. Go do it. Go learn something new. Share that knowledge and try and improve.